I'm Matt Brownell.
And I'm Van Owens.
And I'm Tim Adams.
Welcome to Climbing the Mountain, where we dive into the scriptures and discuss themes, connections, and real-life application. We're kicking off a series here where we're going to examine the Sermon on the Mount and discuss implications for this teaching for Christians today.
All right, welcome back. So we have been talking about judging, about what that looks like to doing it in community. We spent a bunch of time this last episode thinking about, okay, if someone actually is in a sin, what's the spirit that I am to have as I approach that person? And we talked about Galatians 6, 1 through 2, which I thought was a really helpful conversation, focusing on gentleness, right, and carrying one another's burdens. So now we're gonna dive into the last couple of verses of Matthew 7, 1 through 6, which are incredibly confusing to many of us. And I'm really excited about this because this has been one area where the studying for this podcast has, I think, given me the most chance to grow in my own understanding, but still definitely don't think I've figured it out. So really excited to dive in. So Van, you want to read the passage for context?
Will. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Do not judge, or you will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces.
Awesome. All right, we are at verse 6 now. This is a confusing verse to many modern readers. It's a very interesting mental image, right? Dogs, if you think about it, in the context of that time period, though, dogs are not the kind of cute little pets that we think of today, lap dogs, like pigs, the other animal that's portrayed in this section. They were unclean. Think of the dogs that licked up the wicked King Ahab's blood and devoured Jezebel. They were ruthless scavengers. Also, Jesus uses a pearl in one of his famous parables. What does he mean here? Who is this type of person that we would not share our faith with them? Why would we do that? Doesn't God want everyone to know him?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to try to reframe the conversation a little bit here, Matt. I don't think Jesus is talking really about sharing our faith with people here. And here's why. A little bit of background. Jews would talk about Gentiles as being dogs and pigs. Mm-hmm. That was sort of a cultural euphemism. That sounds really insulting in our world. Like if I called anybody in this room a dog or a pig, there would be some conflict resolution that would happen that probably wouldn't go quickly. So we view this as an insult. I think it wasn't quite as insulting in that day. We see it with Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, where, he says it's not right to take the kid's bread and toss it to the dogs. And she kind of owns it. Yeah, you Jews call us dogs. I get it. Like, that's how you think of us. So I think some of the edge that we hear in this is not quite what we perceive, quite as much as we perceive. It doesn't seem like a term of endearment. Like, it doesn't seem like friends, giving each other it doesn't seem quite like that. But I don't think quite the edge that we read into this is there. The other thing that I think is helpful when I'm processing this, before I kind of decide what I think, is stringing pearls was a term that rabbis used for stringing teachings together. And so when I put those things together, it's like, okay, Jesus, because it can feel when we read this in 21st century America, like Jesus is calling, he just said don't judge, and now he's calling some other group of people, probably Gentiles, considering who's in the audience, dogs and pigs. Well, now you're judging them as being dogs and pigs. That feels wrong. That doesn't really jive with what's going on. And so with those couple of pieces of information, that helps me process it. I'm not going to I'll say how I've processed it later in the discussion, but I want to give everyone else a chance to kind of talk a little bit.
Well, no, but I think, so do you think that he's referring to Gentiles?
I think so, but I could also be wrong.
I mean, we could all be wrong. We're just
That's kind of where
we're trying to figure it out.
I'm kind of going on. That was a euphemism. That was like a cultural euphemism of the day. That's my working assumption.
Yeah, and that, I mean, jives with the fact that it's a euphemism. It just feels weird.
Yeah.
I set aside the fact that this whole thing's about judging. I think there's something there might be something else there. But why is Jesus talking about Gentiles in this why is that even on the table in the middle of this part of the sermon, in the whole sermon? I haven't been able to figure that part out. And I was thinking, that might be what it means. But I don't know how it makes, how it's coherent, you know?
He does bring up pagans and other parts, and when he's talking about prayer, don't babble on like the pagans do. So it's not like he's ignoring them, and this could be another. I think it's interesting to think about this in those terms and try to tease out, well, what is he trying to say here about this? What does that mean?
Yeah, I don't know.
To answer your question, I think, again, I'm wrestling through this, so we're having a discussion here in real time.
We're totally discussing. Yes,
that was for the audience, so they know.
I'm just telling them that I agree.
Yeah. So Tim and I are having a discussion. My guess is that he's talking about Gentiles. He may even be talking about people, because there were Jews in the audience who sort of embraced some parts of Gentile culture in a way that would have made other Jews feel very uncomfortable. And so Gentile culture had kind of crept into Judaism, and there was more interaction with Gentiles than there used to be. And I think, this is sort of my working theory, that Jesus is saying, look, you do interact with these people. We're in Roman occupied territory. You cannot avoid interacting with pagans. They are a part of your day-to-day life. And then he's talking about the pearls, the teachings of Judaism, the wisdom that Judaism was providing. Again, we're in a Jewish context here. Yep. What I think he's trying to tell us is, you're not giving this great sacred teaching to Gentiles. Now, it still feels pretty uncomfortable that he's calling them dogs and pigs. That still is like a thing in the back of my head where I'm going, ooh, this feels weird. But I think there was this hatred of the Romans because they weren't following the Jewish customs. There was this resentment of well, they're occupying us, but they're not even Jewish. And the ones that are technically Jewish are only Jewish because it was a politically expedient thing to make them Jewish. And so what I think he's saying is, you take all this stuff that's sacred, that we consider sacred, you take these great teachings, these great moral teachings, and you throw it in front of these people who haven't even agreed to follow it.
Yeah.
Who aren't even trying to do this. How do you think they're going to act?
Yeah.
If I go to my kids' school and start, railing against the morality of all the parents, who aren't even trying to be Christians,
They're going to feel judged by you.
they're going to feel judged. They're
They're
going to be
feel like you're better than me. Oh,
Yeah.
and then just
and they're
cover their
going to,
ears.
and then they react with hostility.
Right.
Well, what did I expect? What should I have expected? Like, they reacted exactly how you would think they would react. And like I think what I think Jesus is trying to tell us is when you throw this stuff in front of these people, of course they're going to trample it because they haven't agreed to follow it. Of course they're going to be hostile to you because now you're putting yourself on the judgment seat and determining that because that they lack value because they're not holding to your sacred things and your pearls of wisdom.
Yeah.
Jim's working
And
theory.
so then if that's the case, then it's connected to the previous verse by, you're looking at yourself, you're coming from a place of humility, you're going to approach someone else with the speck in their eye, but it's not even, it's like if you're trying to
They don't have
hold
the same
someone to the
framework.
standard or framework, it's
Yeah.
like not going to be helpful.
I like the word Matt used in framework is you have a totally different framework. You haven't agreed that you even want to follow this.
Yeah. And then it could be connected to 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul's like, hey, I'm not saying you shouldn't associate with the sexually immoral and the drunkards and stuff, because if by people in the world, because if I was saying that, you'd have to leave the whole world.
Yeah,
Right.
There's
exactly.
Okay, that makes more sense than when I first thought of it being like, oh, Jesus is saying don't talk to Gentiles.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I could see that. I could see that being a.
And I think I also don't think he's trying to say don't help them, don't try to change their framework that they're working under, but don't throw your morality, this thing that you're, saying you can't do in front of all these people because they haven't agreed to it.
I came up to the same conclusion as you, Jim, that this is a tricky thing, but that the sacred pearls are the things of God, his teaching, especially his word. We talked about when we want to use that when we're making judgments with our brothers and sisters, because God is the ultimate authority, and that is truth and not our own. And so I think exactly what you were saying, these dogs, pigs, they're unclean people. I mean, aside from the context they're in, if you think of today, anyone who is not of the people of God, right? Anyone who doesn't have that framework, they're not. This verse 6 acts as a qualifier to everything that came before. So it's at the end of this teaching concerning judgment within the people of God. Oh, and by the way, can't take that same tact with the rest of the people in the world. They don't share your sensibilities, and they will turn and trample you. They will, oh, you're judging me, and I'm gonna come after you and tear you to pieces. I think that is what you see. I've tried to take the things of God and counsel people that are blowing up their lives, and that didn't go well. They thought I was being morally superior to them, and you're judging me, and I feel guilty, and they vomited all over me and lost relationships. And in those situations, I think we have to take a different tact. I think we should show them Jesus's love in a different way. Instead of telling them, here are the things that God says, show them the unconditional love that we've received in a way that helps them know that they're not alone, or helps them deal with whatever brokenness that they're experiencing in an unconfrontational, non-judgmental way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's a different layer here.
Yeah.
So I don't disagree with anything that you guys said. It all sounds accurate to me. But I think that one of the things that Jesus is doing throughout this sermon is there's the old division of Jew and Gentile, which he's sort of addressing here. But the new division that he's kind of introducing in this sermon is goes back to, you have heard it said, and he quotes an Old Testament passage. And then he says, but I say to you. And the division between what you heard and what I'm saying is that we're now talking about the kingdom of God. We're talking about servants who have put themselves under the kingship of God. And so we're not necessarily talking about, we're talking about more than Jews and Gentiles. We're talking about people who are servants of the kingdom and people who are not. And so one of the ways that I looked at this passage, I sort of took a step back and said, so we're talking about judgment, the kind of personal judgment that I do. And if I'm going to be judgy, what I'm doing is one of two things in general. Either I'm judging somebody to belittle them, to say, you're not good enough, you don't qualify, you don't measure up. And the motivation for my doing that is that if I can say that person is disqualified, then that makes me qualified. That if I can say that person is less than, then I can say I'm more than. And so, and he kind of gets at that in verse 1 and 2, where he says, don't judge or you'll be judged. The same measure you use is the measure that's going to be used on you. And then he goes into, and then the other thing is sort of what, the other reason that I judge people is so that I can be included with people that I am perceiving as maybe a little bit better than me, maybe a little bit superior, maybe smarter than me, wealthier than me, more influential than me. So I'm judging based on that to get those people, to feel like I'm a part of that group.
Yeah.
And I think that part of what he's saying in verse 6 is that the way to use the pearls, the way to use the wisdom that God has given me is verses 3 through 5. To take the plank out of my own eye so that I can see clearly to help someone who's got a speck in their own eye. And that verse 6 is more, and this might be far-fetched, but this is what I think is that he's saying in verse 6, he's saying, don't use that to do the second part of judging people. So in other words, don't take my knowledge of the scriptures, my knowledge of the Bible, the pearls that I have, to use it to impress somebody so that I can be looked at like that, to impress a quote unquote Pharisee. So that I can be looked at like that. Because if you do that, they're going to turn on you. You're still going to be perceived as less than. That the only way to do this is to do it the right way, verses 3 through 5 there. Use the pearls to remove the plank from your own eye so that you can see clearly to help your family, to help your community remove the sawdust from their own eyes. And I don't think that is contradictory to what you guys said. I think it's just maybe another layer, and maybe it's just a sort of a personal interpretation that I've taken, but it's just, it's a little bit, a shade different.
Yes, it does feel different. So I understand the approach would be one of humility again, and not like you're taking the scriptures and using them in a way that is like a club, right, or like, which I think
that's pretty much what that's where we got to, is we're not taking the text and using it to like beat people over the head with.
So maybe ubiquitous, we just shouldn't do that, period.
Right.
And
I think all four of us are in agreement.
Always a
on
bad
that.
idea.
I think that's clear. Yeah, we're all there.
Period. Don't do that. but especially maybe because I do think there is something about these unclean animals, especially someone who doesn't have the same framework to even hear it in the first place.
Right.
We could do more harm to someone who's in the world hearing scripture in a way that they then feel like God is so judgy, or God is, and they could take his good word and because it was used as a club, think, I don't want to have anything to do with a God like that.
Can I add to what you just said?
Sure.
I'm continuing the scared little boy analogy from last pod. Is that if that's what had happened to me before I was a Christian, that probably would have just made the scared little boy run away instead of hide in the corner.
Yeah.
Like if we take people and I'm not saying everybody out there is a scared little boy. I'm not saying I'm just saying that's where I was. And if I had felt like people just threw these morality things I wasn't following, nor had I agreed to follow, in front of me, I would have said, well, God's not really a safe place. Like the scared little boy is looking for safety. He's looking for a safe place, and he's looking for a place where he doesn't have to be scared. But now if we're having this morality thrown, these pearls that are great for those who have agreed to follow, but for those who haven't, they are overwhelming and feel judgmental. Now God is not a safe place for the scared little boy. And that scared little boy has to try to find other safe places.
Yeah.
And that's, I think as we've seen, that's the opposite of what God is looking for from us. He is a safe place, and we need to make people feel as though God is a safe place, which means we have to make the church a safe place.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to go up to someone and say, hey, I noticed you've been having a hard time with something. Let me share a scripture with you. Repent or perish. That would probably not get across the love that God has for us.
Yeah.
I think there's an element to this where I was just thinking about how it says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And that word fear means something different to us today than it did then.
Right.
The fear of God is a wow, God is awesome. Oh my goodness, God is so much bigger than, and it's a reverence, it's a love too.
Yeah.
There's there's a couple things here, but my main point that I want to make is that when we take this Matthew 7:1-6, it says, "Don't judge or you'll be judged," but it ends with this passage about the pearls and the swine. And so we know for certain that don't judge can't mean don't discern. And don't use wisdom and your understanding of people and God to figure out how to move in the world, because we have to do that with whatever this passage means, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that I was thinking, you're saying, well, this can't be about like not sharing your faith, or can't be about sharing your faith in some way, because like we just are supposed to proclaim the gospel, like to everyone. And there's an example Paul gives. He preaches to the Jews in a city, I forget which one. It's in Acts 13, and then they're not open. They're jealous, and he's like, okay, I'm going to go to the Gentiles, right? He gives people an opportunity. And we don't assume that before we open our mouth,
Right.
that we know how someone's going to respond, right?
That's a good point.
But, it's not like we throw everything in people's face right away. Like the example of sharing your faith that I was thinking of was it Felix that Paul was or Agrippa that Paul was talking with for a long time? The guy was like king like kept him around for a while. And like, he first went to trial with that king, and he he explained the gospel. Jesus, rose from the dead.
He talks about judgment, and okay, we'll talk about that later.
That's the thing. Like he had a lot of conversations with that king, and he didn't start with judgment. He started with the gospel that I follow the raised Messiah who's here, to redeem us. But he doesn't ignore judgment and repentance and those things. But it came out of it sounded like many, many conversations where this guy was like wanted to hear more. And then at some point he was like, I'm done. Right.
Yeah.
I don't want more. And then if Paul was going to keep on being like, no, I got to tell you more. I got to tell like that wouldn't,
Right.
Yeah.
that would not go well.
Yeah.
So I just think there's so much wisdom that's needed here.
It kind of reminds me a little of Jesus took different tacts with different people. Like with some people, he was just silent. He didn't say anything to them. And other people, he said a lot of things. And I wish that we had his insight all the time.
I think it's important also to, whatever the passage means, to say what it doesn't mean. And I've heard it misused this way in many times. Don't give what's sacred to dogs, or throw your pearls to pigs. There is a use of that among religious people where they sort of get to determine who's a dog and who's a pig.
Yeah.
And that whatever Jesus was saying here, he wasn't saying, don't give to people that you don't like your sacred things. Don't talk to people that you think are less than you. Don't give your pearls to people who are less than you. He's not saying that you get to decide who's a dog and who's a pig. Whatever he means, I think he probably means something relatively specific and not something that is that's
Because
subjective.
if we do, then we're judging.
Exactly.
And for that, so the new perspective that I heard about this is that and this would be slightly different than the Jew-Gentile idea, where this is talking about the Gentiles, but I don't think it's too different in where we come to, is that this is more of a parable instead of an allegory. That it's not actually like, oh, the dogs and pigs are these people and the pearls are this thing, but it's more like, hey, if you give a dog something it doesn't care about, it doesn't care about it, and it might get angry with you because it thinks it's something else, and it's gonna come at you. And just in that sense, that whatever we're sharing to whoever we're sharing it, we need wisdom to discern. Is the way that I'm going to do this actually going to be helpful, or is the thing that I'm thinking of giving to this person
We need
actually going to be helpful?
discernment to judge. We need to make right judgments. We need to exercise our judgment center to judge.
right.
And so that would be that would be another way of thinking about it. And I don't know which one's right, but it is interesting that I don't think it's too different.
It doesn't. You come to the same spot. There is obviously the theory that it's a parable is one that I have not thought about, and that is, it's an interesting theory, and I don't actually have an opinion on it right now because I would have to look through it more. But I do like that they come to the same place of, you don't need to throw your morality in front of people who have not agreed to follow your moral code.
We need to wrap this up. There's so much more that we could talk about, and we're going to close it though. And I want to do one thing. If you can keep it to a sentence or two, there's a question we asked at the very beginning of this, which we haven't covered, and I'd like to close this out with that same question. I want to come back to it. It was basically, as Christians, how do we interact in a world that judges the very word by which we will be judged? It relates a little bit to what we were just talking about here, but I think that'd be a nice place to close it out. Lightning round?
Let's do it. I would say keep and exercise your capacity for discerning right and wrong, but exercise it with the understanding that God is my judge, and that I am in community and fellowship with the other people that I'm trying to navigate this with.
Yep. For me, it's judgment can only come through a lens of love and humility.
Mine would be first seek to understand and then restore relationship patiently and gently.
And for me, I think the trick to all of this is keeping our eyes focused on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. that we need to not let the world push us into its mold, but instead have our minds renewed. Thank you.
Pretty good
Awesome.
summary.
Sounds good. Good stuff. We're a genius.